Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. After a little bit of a quieter period in a relative sense across much of the US for severe weather, we are revving right back up starting tomorrow, Sunday, May 19th, across parts of the central US, and then extending into at least the latter portion of the coming work week. The SPC, as you can see here, has outlined multiple risk areas for the coming days. Really starting tomorrow, again Sunday, May 19th, here's what the SPC has. We have an enhanced risk for tomorrow, level 3 out of 5, really centered on Kansas, from Garden City over to Wichita and areas north up to I-70, with a large slight risk surrounding that up into southwest Nebraska and down into northwest Oklahoma. All hazards are on the table, but we do have the wind threat that is expected to be the main threat with tomorrow's risks. Significant damaging winds are possible, especially in that 30% red stippled area there that coincides with the enhanced risk. But we do have a tornado and large hail threat. Tornado threat is at a 5% right now from western into east central and northern Kansas. And also we have a large hail threat, perhaps significant hail, in the first couple hours of the convective life cycle there, western Kansas down into northwest Oklahoma and far southwest Nebraska. So that's tomorrow, kicking this little sequence off with a bang tomorrow. And then we get into the upcoming week. The SPC has outlined a slight risk once again for Kansas up into Nebraska, Iowa, northwest Missouri, with a marginal risk extending up into the Great Lakes region. We don't have any significant severe areas outlined yet, but we do have that slight risk there that could be a severe weather maker there for Monday. And then we go into Tuesday. We have a few outlooks outlined on our mid-range outlooks, the day 4 to 8 SPC outlook there. This is Tuesday, May 21st, and that has been a day that has been highlighted for quite a while here. For the last several days, we've been pinpointing this day. The models have been pinpointing Tuesday as a potentially significant event from the Midwest down into the southern plains. We now have a 30% area, an enhanced risk there from far eastern Kansas, northern half of Missouri into Iowa, Illinois, southern Wisconsin, with a large 15% area extending down to the Red River on the Oklahoma-Texas border. So a broad area of significant severe weather possible on Tuesday. Wednesday, predictability too low, but then we go into Thursday, May 23rd, and we have now a risk area outlined for parts of Oklahoma into the Arklatex region, including Oklahoma City and Dallas-Fort Worth. So an active stretch ahead. And in this video, we're going to take a look at that active stretch day by day. As always with these videos a few days out from the event, we're going to take a look at three different models, the NAM, GFS, and European model, and kind of compare and contrast the models and see if we can come up with some solutions and possible outcomes for these upcoming days. So we're going to start off with by looking at tomorrow's setup for Sunday and look at that. We're just going to look at the NAM for that, as we're pretty short range in regards to that setup. And then starting with next week's threats, Monday onward, we'll take a look at that those three models and kind of compare and contrast those three and see what we can come up with for possible outcomes for this little outbreak, potential outbreak sequence. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Real quick, just want to take a look at what's currently happening across the U.S. We'll start off with our 500 millibar map on the SPC mesoanalysis page. Not a whole lot going on right now across the country. A little bit of a broad trough there across the northern portion of the country into Canada, and a trough, weak positively tilted trough there across the southeast U.S. But mostly zonal flow across the rest of the country. It was zonal meaning west to east flow. And this is kind of the problem we've had with the past week or two in this somewhat relative lull in severe weather. And I say relative because we still have had several severe weather events for the last several days, including that big-time threat that hit Houston and the Gulf Coast there a few days ago with that potential derecho. So we have had significant severe weather events during this kind of relative lull, but it is a relative lull, relatively speaking, based on that very active stretch we had to end April into early May. But again, we're going to pick that up, and the reason we've had a little bit of a lull here in severe weather is because of this split flow pattern. We've had our two jet streams not really merging into one, and in these split flow patterns, you'll have your polar jet relegated off to the north, and then your subtropical jet here, the belt of stronger flow, relegated off to the south, mostly in the southern U.S. and areas southward. So these two jets have definitely been separate for the past week or two, and that has created a little bit of a difficulty, at least in getting widespread significant severe weather events across the country. In these split flow events, split flow regimes, you'll often have more localized events as you have kind of competing influences from the troughs up north and the troughs down south there in their respective jet streams. So you don't really have them merging into one. When they merge into one kind of singular jet stream with it, and you get these big old troughs here across the central corridor of the U.S., that's when you can get your big time severe weather outbreaks. And that is what's going to be happening with this upcoming sequence. And we'll take a look at the models here to show you that in just a second. But for now, we're still dealing with this little bit of a split flow pattern here, and thus our severe weather threats are fairly localized here, a little bit across the northern plains here the last couple of days, and some across the southeast over the last couple of days as well, but not really any widespread, really broad areas of significant severe weather. Again, that is going to change here in the upcoming several days. Down at the surface, not much going on as well, although we have had moisture kind of sticking around across a broad portion of the U.S., really the eastern half of the U.S. Here is our surface pressure contours, our isobars in black, and then the shaded regions are our surface dew point. The green shading is anything above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can see that broad swath of 60 degree plus dew points there, situated across the eastern half of the U.S. That is a plus as far as severe weather goes for the next few days. Again, oftentimes this time of year you'll have big old cold fronts moving through, sweeping the moisture well out into the Gulf, but that has not happened with our somewhat quiescent pattern over the last several days. And so we've had this broad plume of moisture just sitting here across the U.S., and that will continue to improve as we go into early next week, especially with 70s dew points sitting there just off the Texas coast, right inland there across southeast Texas. Those are going to make their way northward to have a broad swath of very rich Gulf moisture making its way all the way up into the Midwest for our severe weather threats, providing the fuel for our severe weather threats over the coming days. We might start off a little bit on the meager side as far as moisture goes tomorrow. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second, but Monday onward, that moisture should really start to increase for areas to the north, across the central plains into the Midwest, and there we'll get those mid to upper 60s and 70s dew points up that far, and that will allow for that severe weather threat to really ramp up for those areas starting early in the week. How about the quality or depth of that moisture? Right now it is a little bit on the low side. We see here at Fort Worth this morning 69 over 65 at the surface, but our moist layer does not extend very far up above the surface before you get a little bit drier air to work its way in. So very shallow moisture across much of the plains, despite fairly high surface dew points. Going down to Lake Charles there, same thing, very shallow surface moisture with a little bit of drier air aloft there. As you go farther to the southwest, though, down toward Corpus Christi and Brownsville, that's really where our deeper moisture is residing. So very deep moisture down there. Brownsville this morning, 78 over 75. So very high surface dew point, and that moisture actually does extend fairly high into the atmosphere. And so that should make its way northward eventually. For, again, as we said, on Sunday, we may be working with a little bit more meager moisture as far as depth goes and quality goes. That is going to also perhaps lead to more of a damaging wind threat tomorrow. Again, we'll go into tomorrow in just a second. But looking at this, we may have that little bit of drier air aloft and that shallow moist layer at the near the surface sticking around. But eventually, we will get this little bit deeper moisture to work its way up into the areas farther north for a more robust severe threat Monday onward. All right, let's start digging into some model data here, and we'll start off looking at tomorrow's threat. And I don't want to focus on any one day in particular in this sequence, but of course tomorrow is the most pressing of the threats coming up. So we're going to look at that first. We're only going to look at the NAM here for tomorrow, just in the sake of time. And then for our Monday onward threats, we'll take a look at the three different models. So we'll start out at 500 millibars on the 12Z NAM from this morning. Again, this is initialized fairly well. A nice split flow pattern here. Trough across the northern portion of the U.S. With a trough there across the southeast, mostly zonal flow in between. Then you see this little pocket of stronger flow there on the bottom left corner of the image. That's going to start making its way up into the desert southwest going into tomorrow, Sunday. And we're going to see a little bit of a shortwave develop out across the desert southwest, moving into the central plains by tomorrow afternoon. You see a little bit of a downward kink in the height contours there across Colorado, New Mexico, West Texas, into Kansas. That's going to be our shortwave associated with tomorrow's threat. And you see there this is at 4 p.m. Here we are at 7 p.m. A little bit more of a kink there in the height contours, indicative of a little bit of a shortwave. Now that may be a little bit convectively enhanced, but there is a little bit of a shortwave there, and out ahead of that will be your main focus for severe weather in tomorrow's setup. Down at 700 millibars, we can see that shortwave as well, and we actually have a little bit of an initial shortwave. You'll see here as we go into Sunday morning, a little bit of a shortwave does develop here across eastern Colorado into western Kansas, western Nebraska. That may kick off a round of storms tomorrow morning. Those should move off quickly to the northeast, where those set up in specifically Nebraska is going to have an impact on recovery for the afternoon round of storms. So that's why the SPC has the main risk down here in Kansas, where we're not expecting to see as much activity in the morning morning. We'll look at some cam data in a second, but most of that forcing with this shortwave is going to be relegated off toward far northern Kansas and into Nebraska, and that is going to be where we're going to see a morning round of storms tomorrow, impacting the environment for later on. Farther south, not nearly as much of an impact, and so we shouldn't have to worry about any air mass recovery going into the afternoon hours tomorrow farther south. Your little shortwave here going into tomorrow afternoon. You can see there just a broad kink in the flow here across the southern central high plains there, and that should be enough to initiate a second round of storms there ahead of the dry line across western Kansas in particular. Given that we don't have a very robust mid and upper level response, our forcing at those levels is going to be fairly muted, fairly subtle with just a little shortwave there in the flow. Our low level response not going to be very robust as well. Here we are at the surface. We'll go through into Sunday. See a little bit of a broad cyclonic signature there across the southern high plains, but not really a very tight, intense surface low there. We do get additional surface low development off to the north here across Wyoming, eastern Wyoming into the Dakotas. That is due to a little bit of a jet streak up there traversing the higher terrain of the Rockies. Here you see it at 500 millibars. So that's going to traverse the Rockies, going to allow for surface low development up there, but that will be well removed from our moisture down to the south and our most potent forcing with this shortwave. That is going to be farther down to the south, so that will not be of interest as far as severe weather goes, but we will have a little bit of a surface low developing up in here that might help strengthen and back those winds just a little bit out down to the southeast of that surface low, while we maintain perhaps a little bit of a broad surface low down here across the southern high plains as this little bit of a jet streak aloft makes its way across the Rockies. You see down here at the surface once again, we maintain a little bit of cyclonic flow there across the southern portion of the plains there. And so mostly just a broad surface low, one center up here with that northern jet streak in Wyoming, and a broad center down here across the eastern New Mexico, Texas Panhandle vicinity, helping to focus that severe threat just off in between these two, where the forcing from the shortwave moving through the flow is going to be greatest. So we should have a little bit of flow enhancement there at the surface, but at 850 millibars, not a really robust low-level jet to speak of, although we will have some. Here we go at 850 millibars. You'll see that we do have some low-level jet there increasing after dark tonight, and then going into tomorrow, we kind of maintain that a little bit, but it is off to the east. So I'll zoom in here to our central plains sector, and you can see where that plume of low-level jet is, off here across eastern South Dakota, eastern Nebraska, down into south-central Kansas and western Oklahoma. This is at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time tomorrow, and you'll see as we go to our surface map, our main boundary here going to be well back to the west. So our initiation area for storms going to be back here across western Kansas, maybe far eastern Colorado, depending on where this boundary sets up, and then perhaps down into far northwest Oklahoma, the far northeast Texas Panhandle. Again, this is just one model. This could vary a little bit east or west of here, but the NAM at least puts it right here across eastern Colorado into western Kansas. So our storms are going to fire well to the west of this low-level jet. Perhaps if we can get a storm to fire here in northwest Oklahoma, we'll be a little bit closer to that low-level jet core. And this is, again, just at 4 p.m. I'll go back to 850 millibars. As we go into the evening, we start to see a little bit of an increase in the low-level jet going in toward 7, 10 p.m., 1 a.m. or so overnight on into Monday morning. So we do see some increase in low-level jet here, especially down to the south, where you have a nice low-level jet core across Oklahoma. So any storms can remain across this area. We could see an enhanced tornado threat with those. But by this time, we should see storms congealing into an MCS, and that is why the significant wind potential is existing for tomorrow. A couple reasons for that. The low-level jet will increase, so that low-level forcing warm advection will perhaps allow storms to continue to congeal into the overnight hours. But again, as these storms are going to fire tomorrow, so I'll kind of take a step back here, back it out to our moisture and the CONUS sector. So again, we have 60s dew points here across a broad swath of the U.S. this morning into the afternoon, going to maintain themselves. That will continue to make its way northward going into tomorrow. We'll have 60s dew points up into Kansas tomorrow. We see some 70s dew points into southern Kansas. That may be a little bit on the high side. The NAM tends to be a little bit too high with dew points at times because it undermixes the environment. We talked about mixing before. When you have strong surface heating, you can get drier air from aloft to go down to the surface and mix those dew points out a little bit, meaning that they'll decrease a little bit. So the NAM might be a little bit high with the dew points here, especially across western portions of the risk area. But as storms fire here, they're going to be firing out here in somewhat limited low-level moisture relative to the temperature. So temperatures expected to get well into the 80s, perhaps close to 90 tomorrow across these areas, particularly with southern extent. And so with dew points in the upper 50s to low 60s where storms are going to initiate, that is going to allow for large temperature dew point spreads and a quick production and efficient production of outflow with these storms. So outflows, these storms will go up here along the dry line across this area and likely produce outflow very quickly. Those outflows will congeal, and we should get a fairly quick upscale growth into more of an MCS or linear segment there across Kansas, and that is the reason for that more significant wind outlook there across Kansas. And we'll take some soundings here. Take one here. This is at 4 p.m. We'll take one just north of the Garden City area there in western Kansas. So this is where storms are expected to initiate, just ahead of that dry line there. And this is what you can see. So the NAM, as we know, pretty low with surface temperatures there. 80 degrees, it has that bias, so 80 degrees at the surface. Let's take a look at NWS Dodge City and see their forecast for this area just north of Garden City, perhaps, maybe just west of Garden City, north of Ulysses. You see the high tomorrow is 92 degrees. So the NAM is appearing to very much underestimate the surface temperatures here across western Kansas. So if we can suspect that this will be closer to 90 degrees, perhaps on a conservative estimate, then we will see temperature dew point spreads 90 over 60. And again, NAM tends to underdo mixing a little bit, so those dew points could be a little bit lower than this. So the bottom line is that temperature dew point spreads are expected to be very, very high tomorrow where storms initiate, meaning that we'll have quite a bit of outflow production in these storms, and those outflows will quickly conglomerate and then morph that convection into more of a linear segment, or MCS, moving through Kansas with a significant damaging wind potential, both from initial downdrafts there, strong downbursts with that somewhat drier, low-level environment. That will allow for evaporative cooling of the downdrafts, and that will lead to a strengthening and acceleration of the flow as it hits the surface. So very strong outflow winds with the initial supercells here. And then especially as those outflows congeal and the MCS takes shape, they will have a significant damaging wind risk associated with it as well, with the continuation of strong downdrafts and momentum transfer from stronger flow aloft down to the surface. So that is why the damaging wind threat is expected to be the main threat tomorrow, especially across that Kansas corridor. So farther to the south, moisture is a little bit better. The farther south you go is a little bit farther away from the influence of the upper forcing with that shortwave trough. We could see a storm or two develop down here across northwest Oklahoma. A little bit better moisture down here, perhaps, and perhaps a little bit more isolated storm mode here. So we'll take a sounding here, 4 p.m. from northwest Oklahoma, and you'd suspect temperatures would be a little bit higher down here as well. So that damaging wind threat, that outflow potential, would be a little bit higher initially with any more isolated supercell down to the south. Here we are at 0Z, and it might be a little bit tough to pick an uncontaminated sounding here, but let's go down to northwest Oklahoma and see what we can see. So this is going to be at 0Z, 7 p.m., and this is a pretty favorable environment for all severe hazards. So 85 over 67 here at 7 p.m. A little bit more curvature in the low levels of the hodograph. Low level shear, not all that strong there. Fairly unidirectional in the lowest kilometer of the atmosphere, but deep layer shear favorable for supercells, as well as some curvature there in the lowest couple kilometers of the hodograph. Could foster an all hazards threat, but capping is expected to be a little bit stronger with southern extent. But if we can get a storm to go down there on the tail end of this complex, we could see that all hazards threat developed with a photogenic supercell. Up here, again, fairly quick transition to a more of a linearly organized segment there, given congealing outflows, and I don't think we'll be able to recover from that across these areas of Kansas. So we'll have an MCS moving across western into central Kansas going into the evening hours on Monday. You can see how that it just eats out the dew points there. That would be a nice linear segment there moving across Kansas. Farther south, we will have a little bit better moisture going into southwest Oklahoma, northwest Texas. So if any storm can fire down in this area, would have that all hazards threat, perhaps mostly a damaging wind and large hail threat, but a little bit better moisture down here. So if a storm can sustain across western Oklahoma, western southwest Oklahoma, you could see that all hazards threat develop. But looking very unlikely down there, given a little bit stronger capping with southern extent. I'll take a sounding down here from western Oklahoma, and we probably will see a little bit stronger capping to deal with. You see that temperatures do get pretty warm, but we have a little bit of capping to deal with. So TBD whether or not storms will fire. SPC does not seem to think we'll see a robust threat down there to warrant unconditional severe probabilities. They only have a marginal risk down there across western and southwest Oklahoma, but if a storm can fire, it would foster that all hazards threat, with the best chances for Oklahoma being there in northwest Oklahoma, south of the main MCS across Kansas. Here are some convection allowing model solutions for tomorrow's setup. This is the 12Z HER run from this morning. So you see going into the overnight hours tonight into tomorrow morning, we'll get that complex to move across Kansas into Nebraska. Again, that may allow for a little bit of an issue with the recovery up here across southern Nebraska. But back to the west and south of this complex, that will be where our main, most unstable air mass will take place going into tomorrow. And you see there, we have storm initiation along the Kansas-Colorado border there up into western Nebraska by 3 to 4 p.m., perhaps a little bit earlier. But we see a quick transition to a more linear, clustered mode there across Kansas going into the evening hours tomorrow. Very limited development down to the south across Oklahoma, and mostly just a quick transition to a line moving across Kansas as we go into Monday morning. Let's take a look at the WRF ARW model from 12Z this morning. Very similar solution here. That complex moves across Kansas into Nebraska tomorrow morning. And then we get development to take place across western Kansas, pretty far east compared to some of the other models here, but fairly early in the day, 20Z or so. That's 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Initial supercells quickly morphing into more of a clustered linear mode, moving into perhaps northern Oklahoma going into the evening hours tomorrow. Looking at the NSSL WRF model as well, you can see not much activity the farther south you go, given some remnant capping in place and less forcing aloft. So NSSL WRF has that complex in tomorrow morning. And then we get additional development along the Kansas-Colorado border there by 3 p.m. or so. We do have some isolated development down here across the Texas Panhandle into western Oklahoma. So could see a couple supercells there, but again, a fairly quick transition as outflows conglomerate there across Kansas. We do see some supercell development on the tail end of the line there on this particular model, so we'll have to watch that for sure, as that could foster an all-hazards threat across western and northwest Oklahoma if that does take place late tomorrow afternoon into early evening. All right, let's now dive into our threats going into next week. So we're going to look at, again, 3 different models, the 12Z NAM, the 12Z GFS, and the 6Z Euro. The 12Z Euro not quite in yet as I'm recording this, so we'll use the 6Z Euro for our purposes here. So we'll start off again at 500 millibars. We'll start off at 0Z Monday, so 7 p.m. tomorrow evening, Sunday evening, and then we'll go from there. So among all the models, very similar positioning of the little shortwave there across western Kansas into northwest Oklahoma. You'll see there on the NAM, GFS, and the European model, very similar solutions there with that little kink in the height contours and a little bit of a belt of stronger flow there across western Kansas. So model's pretty locked in going through tomorrow evening. Let's go now into Monday. Just as a reminder, Monday is the slight risk across parts of Kansas into Nebraska, southwest Iowa, northwest Missouri there. So let's go into Monday here. So we'll progress the 500 millibar map on the NAM first. And you see here we still are dealing with somewhat of a split flow pattern. Our main polar jet up here across to the north and the subtropical jet here to the south. Separate jet streaks there, and we haven't quite merged them into one. And we're going to be dealing with this on Monday. And as a result, our flow aloft on Monday, our forcing aloft on Monday, may be a little bit more on the nebulous side. So here we are going into Monday morning. This is 7 a.m. Monday, not quite merged yet into one. And here we are by 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time on Monday. So our main area of interest going to be up in here, at least as the SPC sees it. And you can see why the forcing is a little bit on the nebulous side. Our main trough starting to take shape here as the two jet streams merge into one. Belt of stronger flow here well to the southwest across the desert southwest. And right here, we're kind of stuck in the middle. A little bit of a jet streak to the north, main jet streak well off to the southwest, main trough axis well back here across the far western U.S. So we're not really looking at any major forcing mechanisms for the event on Monday. So here it is at 4 p.m., 7 p.m., not much of a difference here. We do see somewhat defluent flow here aloft, and we can perhaps see that at 250 millibars here. We do have the leading edge of the jet streak making its way into western Kansas, or eastern Kansas and eastern Nebraska by late Monday afternoon into early evening on Monday. So that could allow for a little bit of stronger forcing here. We do again see somewhat defluent flow, slightly more west-southwesterly flow across northeast Nebraska, and slightly more west-northwesterly flow across southeast Kansas. So we do see a little bit of defluence aloft, the spreading apart of those wind vectors in the upper levels of the atmosphere. That may perhaps aid in at least very subtle forcing across this region, but as far as any shortwave troughs or troughing goes, we don't really see that here at 500 millibars until we go into Tuesday. We'll talk about Tuesday here in a second, but for Monday, the overall forcing mechanisms may be a little bit nebulous, especially as we go into the afternoon and early evening. Past that, we might have a little bit more help, but early on in the Monday event, a little bit nebulous as far as where the forcing is going to come from. Let's take a look at the GFS for Monday. So here we are, that shortwave for Sunday's event moves off, and again, a fairly similar look here on the GFS. Here we are at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time on Monday. Again, not much to see here. Main jet streak across the desert southwest, jet streak off to the north, and we're kind of stuck in between the two here. Perhaps a little bit stronger flow making its way into eastern Kansas by Monday evening, but overall a very similar picture to what the NAM was showing, with not a whole lot of forcing evident, not a lot of waves evident here in the flow across these regions. European model probably says a lot of the same here, and so a fairly similar solution, maybe a little bit farther back with the leading edge of the stronger flow here across Kansas, with the main jet streak still here down to the southwest and off to the north. So very similar picture here for Monday, nebulous forcing, at least in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere. Let's go down to 700 millibars and see if we can see any little short waves rotating through. So here we are going into Monday morning, and we perhaps see a little bit of something here maybe across central Kansas there, a little bit of a kink in the height contours there across central Kansas into southern Nebraska. Out ahead of that, maybe a little bit of a favored region for storm development there, but it is very, very subtle. So we may have to rely on strong surface heating in our surface boundaries to get the job done. Let's go down to 700 millibars on the GFS here real quick, and then we'll move on to our surface pattern going into Monday, excuse me. So here we are, that main shortwave moves off. And going into Monday afternoon, pretty much the same here. A little bit of a kink in the height contour, so that may be just enough to initiate a storm or two. Would not expect us to get a lot of storm coverage here with such subtle forcing in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere, but that shortwave could be just enough to get a storm or two to go there across the eastern half of Kansas into southeast Nebraska Monday afternoon into evening. Going forward there into Monday night, we see a little bit stronger flow making its way in there by 1 a.m. on Tuesday. So overnight, we could see an increase in the intensity and coverage of convection here across this area. But for the main portion of the daytime risk, maybe this little shortwave will be enough, but it probably will lead to just a storm or two developing if storms can develop. So we'll back it up here to Sunday evening, and we'll take a look at the surface pattern now. So let's go down to the surface, starting at Sunday evening. Let me get there on the European model as well. So we'll back that up here to 0Z Monday, 7 p.m. Sunday. So here we are on the 12Z NAM. So again, we have that surface low center up here into western South Dakota, broad cyclonic flow here across the southern plains at the surface. We move on into Monday, and we see a little bit stronger surface low development out here across the southern plains. Here we are at 7 a.m. Monday. Nice surface low there across the Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma, and that may start to tighten a little bit going into the day as we get strong surface heating out west. And we start to see maybe a little bit of a warm front develop out here with this broad cyclonic flow across the southern high plains. A little bit of a warm front it looks like in here. So that could be a boundary that may allow for a little bit stronger convergence there at the surface to initiate a storm or two in this environment. So the NAM certainly has the boundary, the warm frontal zone, broad surface low here across the southern high plains. Warm frontal zone looks to be somewhere across this area here, perhaps. Just kind of eyeballing it here as we go. Warm front looks to be kind of in that region there. And assuming, and I assume we'll have a nice dry line down there to the south of that boundary. So if we go to our dew points here, our warm front looks to be right in there. Nice little dry line bulge there across northwest Oklahoma into southern Kansas by Monday afternoon. This may be a little bit far west. I'd like to see what the other models have here in play, but let's take it a step at a time. So this is 4 p.m. on the NAM. We'll go down to the surface here on the GFS and see what that looks like here. So we do get surface low development out there across the central southern high plains going into Monday afternoon. GFS certainly a little bit farther to the north, it looks like, with the boundary. So your main warm front, your surface low back out in here. Warm front looks to be draped somewhere in this vicinity here. And then south of that, you'll have your dry line. So the boundary here on the GFS, a little bit different than the positioning of the NAM. Looks fairly similar, may have it a little bit farther south there, but the northern portions of the boundary may be fairly similar there. So a little bit tough to tell, a little bit of a complicated surface pattern here, but overall the idea is fairly the same. We'll have a perhaps triple point setting up here somewhere in south central to central Kansas, maybe as far south as northwest Oklahoma here on Monday, and that probably will lead to stronger surface convergence and help compensate for the lack of forcing aloft here on Monday. So looking at dew points on Monday, we'll probably see a little bit better how the boundaries are going to play out. So going back to Sunday evening, we'll go to the dew point here on the NAM. So dew points, we have 70s dew points on the NAM here up to the southern Kansas area. Those will continue to stream their way northward going into Monday afternoon. So here we are Monday afternoon, 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time on Monday. I'll zoom back in here. So you can see the 70s dew points all the way up into the eastern half of Kansas. A little bit of a bulge there in the dry line, perhaps a little bit of a triple point there in that area. GFS, very similar to that. So here we are on Monday. You see that bulge is a little bit farther off to the north. So the bulge here in the dry line well up into perhaps north central to northeast Kansas. On the NAM, it's much farther south. So the placement of these features is definitely off among the models. The European model certainly seems to favor the NAM solution as well. You can see the dry line bulge down here across southern Kansas, northwest Oklahoma. So that certainly favors the NAM solution as well. We'll have to see how that plays out. GFS does tend to be a little bit more progressive than the other models, so we'll see how that plays out. But if this does come to fruition, would not be surprised to see the risk area shift a little bit farther back to the southwest across parts of southern Kansas and even northwest Oklahoma if those trends continue. But the overall idea is the same. We'll have a little bit of a bulge in the dry line / triple point here, setting up somewhere across Kansas, and ahead of that will probably be your favorite area for storm initiation, especially with that little shortwave looking to be present aloft. Would not suspect that we have a very strong low-level response, given that we don't have a strong upper-level response, just very subtle forcing aloft. Quick look at the low-level jet, and you'll see that is the case there. Not much low-level flow to speak of. A little bit, maybe 20 to 25 knots there across eastern Kansas before we increase that going into the evening hours and overnight hours to Monday into Tuesday. So let's take a sounding here on Tuesday from both of these models. This is the NAM model. Would suspect if the NAM model comes to fruition, we'll be much farther back to the south there across southern Kansas. On the GFS, a little bit farther off to the north. So here we are at the NAM. This is a looking pretty favorable look for a severe weather threat on Monday. So you can see a little bit deeper moisture here compared to what we saw with our observed soundings this morning. A little bit deeper moisture up above 850 millibars, 77 over 71 at the surface, ample instability, 3,500 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. A little bit of capping remaining here, but assuming that the NAM is a little bit too cool with surface temperatures, don't think that'll be too much of an issue. Especially if we have a little short wave, a little bit of convergence there at the surface, that should help overcome a little bit of remnant capping here. But a fairly favorable look for all severe hazards here. That would favor a large hail threat, nice veering and strengthening of the winds with height, going into the low levels of the atmosphere, strong deep layer shear for supercells. So I suspect maybe one or two supercells would fire here ahead of the triple point with that all hazards threat on Monday at late afternoon to early evening. GFS a little bit more pronounced with the capping inversion aloft, fairly deep moisture still though, so that would be perhaps able to be overcome by a little bit stronger convergence there at the triple point between the warm front and dry line and that shortwave aloft. So here we are at 7 p.m. there on the NAM, 7 p.m. on the GFS, fairly similar look, fairly destabilized there, not much capping left by 7 p.m. on the GFS, with a little bit stronger low-level moisture and surface temperatures, and a nice look for all severe hazards there on Monday, going into early Monday evening in Kansas. Nice curvature there in the hodograph. That would favor that all hazards threat if a storm or two can develop. And again, it is a little bit conditional given such subtle forcing, but I think a storm or two very well could develop there ahead of the triple point going into late Monday afternoon, early evening, somewhere in the Kansas vicinity ahead of that little bulge and triple point there. So that's what is going to be the case for Monday. Let's now take a look at Tuesday. Tuesday, again, is our kind of banner day so far as advertised in this sequence. We have a 30% area outlined there for Iowa into southern Wisconsin, Illinois into Missouri. So a very, perhaps significant severe threat could be on tap for Tuesday. So let's get into some model comparisons for Tuesday. So here we are back at 500 millibars starting at 7 p.m. on Monday. So as the models have it progged on 7 p.m. Monday, we'll go from that point forward. So here we are, 500 millibars on the 12Z NAM, and it's a little bit of a weird progression with this overall system. So we have this jet streak down here across the desert southwest, and the main axis of the trough is actually back, it looks like backed out in here across Nevada into California. But watch what happens as we go into Tuesday. We kind of get this jet streak to move through the flow and develop a little bit of a short wave associated with it going into midday on Tuesday. So this is at 1 p.m. Central Time on Tuesday. A little bit of a short wave in here with this jet streak, and our main trough is still actually back in here. So I don't believe this little short wave is associated with this back trough. It's probably one big old broad long wave trough with embedded short waves within it. This lead one tends to be looks to be a little bit more subtle, perhaps a little bit more low amplitude than this one, a little bit higher amplitude associated with a separate jet streak back in here. So this is 1 p.m. 4 p.m., 7 p.m. on Tuesday. So here we are at 4 p.m., fairly progressive little shortwave here. So this is the axis of the shortwave. Looks like places like southern Minnesota, Iowa into Wisconsin, Illinois could be under the gun there. This SPC outlook, perhaps just looking at the NAM here, looks like it might be a little bit too far to the south. Just eyeballing the placement of the shortwave, looks like that 30% area, the main area, would be more so up in this region here, out ahead of the axis of the shortwave. Still would have some forcing with this jet streak. It is kind of an elongated little shortwave here, so forcing associated with this jet streak would stretch all the way back down into southern Iowa, Missouri, into Kansas, but ahead of the main axis of the shortwave, that would be up in here across Minnesota, eastern Iowa, western Wisconsin, northwest Illinois. So just keeping that in mind there, we'll look at the timing here on the GFS. So this is the GFS 500 millibar plot here. Sorry, this is the 250 millibar. Let me go back to the 500 millibar here. So this is 500 millibars on the GFS. Very similar progression here. The main jet streak is well out ahead of the actual axis of the trough back here. So here we are, 18Z. 21Z, 4 p.m., your axis is more so out in this region here. So perhaps a little bit farther back than what the NAM was showing. The NAM, well, looks to be right on, actually. So the NAM and GFS are pretty much right on here with their depiction of the timing of the trough. So again, that makes me think that we may see a little bit more of an eastward to northeastward shift of the overall main outlook area here in upcoming outlooks. Let's look at the European model, see what it has with this jet streak. So this is at 21Z, and this is why maybe there's a little bit more discrepancy among the models. Your axis of the trough is way back to the southwest compared to the other models. So this is the European model there, and this is the GFS, well out to the east of the European model. European model certainly not nearly as progressive as the other two models. That would put more of that southern Minnesota, western Iowa, northwest Missouri corridor under the gun if this solution were to come to fruition. Let's just real quick, I want to take a look at the ensemble models, because again, these operational models are just one member of the overall ensemble. So perhaps the operational models here are not quite on board with the overall ensemble members. So let's take a look at the GFS ensemble here. So let's go into Tuesday here. So this is Tuesday, and it looks like the GFS ensembles are pretty much all on board with a little bit more progressive positioning of the trough compared to the European model here. A little bit farther back there across Nebraska into Kansas, whereas this one here more so into Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri as far as the axis of the trough goes. So it looks like the GFS operational GFS is much more on board with the ensembles. So it looks like the European model is a little bit on the slow side. The operational European model. Let's take a look at the ensemble European model here. This is the 12Z European ensemble at 500 millibars. So the 12Z model is actually rolling in now as I'm finishing up this video here. But the 12Z ensembles certainly look to be maybe a little bit less progressive than the NAM and the GFS, but not quite as progressive as that 6Z operational run. Just curious here, we'll take a quick look at the 12Z European model here just to compare the ensemble to the operational run. We've been looking at the 6Z GFS, remember, and here we are at the 12Z run. Looks very, very potent there, and perhaps catching a little bit farther up to the other couple of models, but still perhaps is a little bit slower than the other two models. So we'll have to keep that in mind. There is some model discrepancy creeping its way in, and we'll have to, at least as far as the timing and progression of this shortwave goes. But the overall idea is the same among the models. We'll have a nice potent shortwave moving its way through the flow here into the Midwest, making that area the target for Tuesday regarding significant severe weather. Down to the surface, I'm sure we'll see a little bit of a timing difference in the progression of the surface low among the models between the NAM GFS and then the Euro, given the timing and the difference in timing in the upper level wave. But here is the surface low on the 12Z NAM. You can see it moves off quickly to the northeast. By midday on Tuesday, 1 p.m., our surface low already there in southeast Minnesota, far northwest Iowa. So very progressive surface low here. 4 p.m. it's already up there in southern Minnesota, at least the center of the surface low up there in southern Minnesota. So that makes me think your threat, if this would come to fruition, would be a little bit farther off to the north and east of where the SPC has it now, mainly across southern Minnesota, western to southwest Wisconsin, northwest Illinois, the eastern half of Iowa. But again, this is just one model. Here's the GFS progression. Very much the same there, and even perhaps a little bit more progressive than the NAM. The center of the surface low there is already almost into western Wisconsin on the GFS by 4 p.m. on Tuesday. The NAM is a little bit farther back to the west, so very progressive solutions here from the NAM and the GFS. The GFS especially, that would make your surface, your main sector for severe activity much farther off to the north and east than what the SPC has, but we'll have to see how that plays out over the next few model runs. Here's the European model. Given the farther back, the less progressive nature of the upper level, the mid and upper level wave, would suspect that the surface low is much farther back as well, and that is exactly the case. The surface low here in far southeast South Dakota by 21Z 4 p.m. on Tuesday, so your severe threat would be a little bit closer to where the SPC has it now. Much farther back down into southern Minnesota, western and central Iowa, northwest Missouri. So we'll have to keep that in mind, and we'll have to see how that plays out over the coming model runs. So Tuesday, a little bit up in the air as far as where we are going to see our main severe threat, given the progressive nature of the system, the differences in progression among the models. But the idea is the same. We'll have a strong surface low, strong little shortwave with associated strong jet streak aloft with ample moisture here. We'll take a look at the moisture on the NAM. Very robust moisture ahead of the surface low and shortwave there. I'll zoom in here to the Midwest sector. Very tight little tongue there of moisture feeding up into that surface low. So that would make me think there's going to be an arc of storms, perhaps semi-discrete supercells, perhaps given strong forcing, maybe a little bit more of a mixed mode type setup. But overall, a broad warm sector here up across the Midwest with upper 60s to 70s dew points here across this area for a very robust severe threat here. Strong kinematics at play, likely strong thermodynamics at play. Here is a forecast sounding ahead of that surface low and ahead of that moisture boundary there. Very favorable look for all severe hazards there. Very strong instability, over 3,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE with strong low-level instability as well. Steep lapse rates aloft, very robust updrafts there. And this would favor tornadoes. It is not a ton of curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, but there certainly is veering and strengthening of the winds with height in the lowest kilometer or so before very strong venting of the precipitation off to the north, perhaps photogenic tornadoes with any tornadic supercells that would take shape here. Kind of a hybrid sort of cold core-esque kinematics with very much more normal thermodynamics here. You'll often see this kind of a hodograph in cold core setups. Somewhat limited low-level curvature before very strong venting of the precipitation way off to the north, well away from the main mesocyclone of these storms, which favors very photogenic tornado viewing. Here on the GFS, you'll see here a very similar look here. Strong, broad, warm sector here across the Midwest, all the way down into the southern plains. I assume we will see a threat in the southern plains as well. If given strong moisture here, cannot rule out a few severe storms as far south as Kansas, Oklahoma, southern Missouri, western Arkansas. But here we are up in the Midwest, a little bit more of an elongated, broad, not quite not quite the eye candy of what the NAM was showing, but here still very potent look with a broad warm sector with very rich low-level moisture on the GFS. And a very similar look to the profiles. Not quite as unstable as the NAM, but still plenty of instability for a severe threat. Nearly 2,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE with a very similar kinematic profile to what the NAM was showing. Somewhat limited curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, but very strong venting of the precipitation, a little bit of backing there in the mid-levels to vent the precipitation away from any mesocyclones in these storms. So certainly with stronger low-level instability, this kind of hodograph does work often up in this region, and so we could see that all hazards threat materialize into Tuesday afternoon. Given strong forcing, perhaps I think eventually we'll see storms congeal into a squall line. You can see the progressive nature of the moisture boundary there, the cold front / dry line, whatever you want to call it. Very progressive nature to that. So, and strong forcing from the short wave with that strong jet streak. So would assume that eventually convection will congeal into more of a line, but we won't get too deep into the specifics yet. It does look like a potent event up there in the Midwest, but some details to work out. But a broad warm sector, strong kinematics should foster an all hazards threat there on Tuesday. Quick look beyond Tuesday here. The model discrepancy increases pretty greatly. We'll just look at the GFS real quickly here going into the rest of the week. Wednesday, we kind of see that main shortwave move through. Could see a renewed round of severe storms going into Wednesday across the Midwest ahead of that shortwave trough. And then on Thursday, a little bit of a shortwave developing down here across the southern plains, stronger flow down there as well. And that's where the SPC has that main risk there, Oklahoma into the Arklatex. Could probably see strong moisture maintaining itself across this area with perhaps a little bit of convection early there on the GFS, a little bit of a hole there in the dew points. So still the details for Thursday unknown, but the SPC has seen enough confidence to introduce that threat across the southern plains into the deep south there, mid-south there for Thursday. So that is going to wrap things up for this video. Just an initial forecast for these next several days. Looks to be an active stretch for sure. Overall specifics on the threats, the specific threats, timing, locations, still not quite ironed out yet. We'll need to see some more agreement in the model runs to allow that to happen. But for now, this is what the SPC has. This is for tomorrow, Sunday, May 19th. Enhanced risk there across much of Kansas. Level 3 out of 5 there. Garden City over to Wichita up to the I-70 corridor with a slight risk surrounding that up into southwest Nebraska, northwest Oklahoma. Again, mainly going to be a damaging wind threat. Initial storms will be fairly outflow dominant given high temperature dew point spreads and limited low-level shear. So that should foster more of an outflow dominant storm mode. Those outflows will congeal, and you'll see more of a line, a solid MCS making its way across Kansas there, going into late tomorrow afternoon and early evening. A chance for a discrete supercell or two down there in northwest Oklahoma, and perhaps as far south as southwest Oklahoma as well. But a little bit stronger capping, a little bit less forcing down with southern extent is going to make it a little bit difficult to sustain a storm down there. But if a storm does go, we could see an all-hazards threat developing, particularly across northwest Oklahoma. That is for tomorrow. Then we go into Monday. SPC has that threat out for Monday. Again, a little bit nebulous as far as the forcing goes for Monday, but the models do show that we will perhaps have a severe threat there ahead of a little bit of a short wave and dryline bulge / triple point there somewhere across Kansas. A little bit of a difference among the models and where that is. Could see this extended a little bit farther to the southwest in future outlooks, but for now they have it the slight risk level 2 out of 5 across much of Kansas into southeast Nebraska, southwest Iowa, and northwest Missouri. Would not expect to see a lot of storms, at least initially, in this environment given subtle forcing, but supercell or 2 could form here across parts of Kansas, and then eventually as the low-level jet ramps up and forcing increases into the evening hours, we'll probably see an increase in storm coverage there, moving off to the eastern portion of the risk area. All hazards would be in play on Monday. Then we go into Tuesday, some timing differences with the ejection of the wave and the surface low, but overall the SPC has the 30% enhanced risk area there across the orange shaded region here, southwest Iowa, northern half of Missouri, western Illinois, southwest Wisconsin. Would not be surprised if trends like as what we saw on the NAM and GFS continue, that this risk will be shifted a little bit off to the north of where we have it now, up into southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, much of western Wisconsin, but we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Certainly does look like a potent day with strong instability and strong kinematics at play. And then we could see a threat down there into the southern plains. A little bit less forcing down there, but we could see a threat on Tuesday into the southern plains. And then on Thursday, risk area is outlined for Oklahoma into the Arklatex. Not much to say about that yet. We'll have to wait for some more model runs and more model agreement, but we could see some significant severe weather down that way on Thursday. I'll be back with additional videos as needed as these days approach. We'll definitely try to do videos on the more potent days of the setup of the sequence at the very least. But it does look like a very active stretch of severe weather ahead with all hazards on the table, starting specifically tomorrow through at least the latter portion of this coming week. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.